It's National Signing Day across the college landscape, and Locked On has you covered with the latest for your favorite college teams. I'm Jourdan Black. And the rich keep getting richer when it comes to recruiting. And of course, that means we're talking about the SEC. Alongside recruiting expert John Garcia, we welcome in Chris Gordy of Locked On SEC. Chris, take us through the top 5 teams when it comes to recruiting classes for this class of 2023.
Yeah, I mean, in last year A&M had their nice little jump up to number 1 out of nowhere, and that was all fun and exciting. But now we're back to the Blue Bloods. It's Alabama and Georgia sitting right there at the top, number 1 and number 2, and then of course LSU and Brian Kelly. They continue to do work. It just seems whoever is the head coach at LSU, they're always going to recruit well because of that talent-rich state. Josh Heupel in Tennessee doing a fantastic job jumping into the top 10, and Florida was right up there. If they had closed the deal with Jaden Rashada like they should have, they would have been top 10 right there. But great classes overall, I think highlighted by Alabama and Georgia being the top dogs once again.
Some really big news today, though, for the SEC, for South Carolina. John, tell us about the commitment of Nicholas Harbor, what that means for the SEC, what it means for South Carolina, just how big that is.
Yeah, I think that was, as national recruiting battle from a traditional standpoint as we got in this class of 2023. So a kid from Washington, D.C., no real ties to any of his finalists outside of, Maryland being his home state. And Oregon, South Carolina battle comes down to the Gamecocks there in the end. So a huge plant the flag moment for not only South Carolina and Shane Beamer, but the SEC, another elite recruit, 5-star talent heading down to SEC country from outside of the traditional SEC footprint, which has really been kind of the detriment of every other conference over the last 10, 15 years. It's not only keeping SEC talent home, but going into your backyard and taking Texas and California and Mid-Atlantic and Northeast talent along with it. And Harbor's just the latest example of that. From an athletic standpoint, he could be a 5-star tight end or a 5-star defensive end. There are just not many human beings walking around at 6'5", 230 with those kind of accolades. So you could see why it was such a big battle and a long battle over several years for a lot of these programs. So for a relatively young coaching staff to go out and win it in South Carolina was a really big deal. And he becomes not only their class headliner, but the guy who puts that school back on notice. Hey, this is a program that's going to be ambitious and bold on the recruiting front, regardless of where you're from. And Harbor will be reflected as that poster child going forward.
Chris, any teams that really needed to make significant moves in this recruiting class and maybe underachieved, if you will?
Yeah, I was a little surprised with Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. I mean, the recruiting rankings are so weird now because what are we talking? Are we talking just kids out of high school? Or are we doing the combo thing and we're combining transfers? Because Ole Miss has done a really good job through the transfer portal, not so much on the recruiting trail this cycle. So, it's kind of a give and a take. And hey, okay, we're not going to bring in a bunch of highly touted freshmen, then we're going to go get some guys from the transfer portal that are proven already. So if you like that approach, then you call it a win and say Ole Miss did a great job. But if you like the kids that are going to come on campus and be there for 3-4 years and develop, then I'd say Ole Miss probably underachieved in that category.
But speaking of the Mississippis, John, you mentioned one of your biggest surprises being the other team from Mississippi.
Yeah, the Bulldogs. They won a head-to-head, big-time late riser battle for Jonathan Davis, in-state pass rusher, who was a good old-fashioned Egg Bowl battle to the point where he visited both Oxford and Starkville the final weekend of the recruiting cycle. He opted for Mississippi State on Wednesday morning. They also went down into South Alabama to pick up a big-time cornerback recruit, flip him from USM there at the end of the day. So a great close to the recruiting cycle for Mississippi State and a very big class, which, let's be honest, it's a bit surprising. Obviously, huge tragedy going down in December, RIP to Mike Leach. That all happened a week before the first signing day. And Mississippi State galvanized its recruits, held on to a good class, and then followed it up with not only portal additions and some interesting ones with kids coming back to the state of Mississippi, but a nice high school recruiting finish, both head-to-head against Ole Miss and elsewhere. And that's not something I necessarily expected a couple weeks back.
Chris, Alabama and Georgia, when we talk about the rich getting richer, it's those two leading the pack. How big is the gap between those two and the rest of the pack in the SEC recruiting-wise?
I mean, it depends what you want to, classify here as gap. I would say, did LSU and some of the other schools get some elite talent? Yeah. I mean, we just talked about Harbor going to South Carolina. That's elite. But Alabama got like 5 Harbors. So, it's one of those things where they just keep reloading. And this is going to be an interesting offseason for both teams because we talk about stability in the SEC. A lot of other teams know who their quarterbacks are. Mississippi State with Will Rogers, Jaden Daniels coming back to LSU. Alabama and Georgia are the 2 schools that are absolutely loaded with talent, but they have big question marks at that quarterback spot. So, look, you can load up all the 4 and 5-star talent you want on National Signing Day, and that's what Bama and Georgia did. But it doesn't mean anything if you don't figure out who this quarterback is going to be. Who's replacing Bryce Young? Who's replacing Stetson Bennett? So, big question marks for those guys. They'll figure it out in spring ball. But yeah, when you got 4 and 5-star talent everywhere, it makes it a little bit easier for you to keep on rolling and have dominant season after dominant season, whereas a lot of the other schools in the SEC are still playing catch up.
When you talk about recruiting, you're talking about guys who can make an immediate impact next season. So which team has a number of those guys, and which team has plenty of those guys and is a team that we're maybe not talking about, maybe the unexpected hero and the team that maybe is going to surprise us as a whole next season?
Yeah, I'll jump in here and I'll say Auburn. I think you talk about outperforming expectations. This class was in the dumpster under Brian Harsin. There's really no other way to put it. He was a lame duck before he was even fired. And kids talked about it. They knew it. That perception travels in recruiting. These are impressionable teenagers after all. But what Hugh Freeze has done since taking over has been nothing short of remarkable. Not only keeping great talent home, but going out and flipping them from your rivals. So the Keldrick Falks, the Jeremiah Cobbs of the world headed to Auburn, Kayan Lee, the Ohio State flip, those guys are going to get run day one at Auburn. And I think when your best commits are those instant impact players, that certainly helps you kind of keep the ball rolling in what should be a new elevated recruiting standard under Hugh Freeze. Now, of course, you got to do it on the field and try to match that energy. But from a recruiting standpoint, from point A to now, I mean, Auburn's come the furthest and the longest way from zero or in the 50s or 60s all the way up into the top 15 or 20 nationally and top 10 in the SEC. If you'd have said anything close to that, every single Auburn fan I know would have signed up day one. And that's exactly what Hugh Freeze has accomplished in a few months.
Anyone stick out for you, Chris?
I'll just say Reuben Owens from Texas A&M. I think that's a guy that can step right in and start from day one at running back, who's a big 5-star recruit from the Houston area. And they lose Devon Achane. He heads off to the draft. They lost Isaiah Spiller a year ago. So Reuben Owens, I think, is the next great running back in line to step in and play immediately there for Texas A&M. And I think can have an immediate impact. And when you talk about all the freshmen they have from last year with Evan Stewart and Connor Wegman back at quarterback, you start to look at A&M and yeah, they went 5-7, but man, this thing could turn around very quickly if some of these recruits that they sign hit like Reuben Owens.